And a lot of them say they are very angry at the United States. They voiced that anger to us and also absolutely ripped into President Trump.
So as we just heard, leaders of G7 nations have gathered in Canada, and South Korea's President Lee Jae-myung is also there, making it his first overseas trip since taking office.
They attacked us, she says. We were living our normal lives and they attacked us. If someone strikes the United States, would they not answer? Of course they would. We're not doing anything but defending ourselves.
South Korea, a country once crushed by war, is now offering cutting-edge weapons and technology that could make Canada a global military powerhouse.
In less than 24 hours at the G7 summit in Alberta, a quiet revolution unfolded, and it didn't come from Washington. As President Trump abruptly left the summit, Canada stepped into the spotlight and made three major moves that stunned observers. First, Ottawa signed an Arctic Defense Pact with South Korea, allowing Seoul to co-produce patrol ships in British Columbia while supplying drones for Canada's northern surveillance.
The relationship we had with the United States, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperations, is over.
It was the kind of bilateral defense deal Washington would typically broker, but this time the U.S. wasn't even in the room. Then came the second blow. As the U.S. finalized its $60 billion cut to USAID, Canada unveiled a $544 million development guarantee program for Latin America. Ottawa promised financing for wind farms, cocoa factories, and climate insurance in the very regions Washington had just walked away from. It wasn't just charity, it was a diplomatic statement. And finally, in what may prove the most consequential shift, Canada announced a critical minerals alliance linking its rare earth reserves with Germany's processing capacity, South Korea's sensor tech, and Japan's recycling systems. Together, these nations are building an alternative to China's mineral dominance, and doing so without the U.S. In just one summit cycle, Canada went from G7 host to geopolitical architect. While Washington's seat sat empty, Ottawa redrew the map of strategic partnerships. So, the real question is this: was Alberta the moment global power began tilting north, or was it the first sign that U.S. leadership is no longer guaranteed in a multipolar world?
President Trump has left the G7 summit in Canada early because of the continuing crisis in the Middle East. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt made the announcement Monday evening, saying President Trump is returning to Washington so that he can attend to many important matters.
While President Trump's early exit from the G7 summit made headlines, the real story was unfolding quietly in side rooms, bilateral briefings, and backdoor meetings. With Washington suddenly absent from the coordination table, Canada wasted no time filling the vacuum. The first bold move came from the defense sector. In a bilateral meeting with South Korea's new president, Lee Jae-myung, Canada announced a historic defense industry swap. Surveillance drone sensor packages for Arctic monitoring would be built in South Korea, while hybrid-powered patrol vessels designed in Canada would be constructed under license in Korean shipyards. For the first time, Seoul gained a foothold in the Five Eyes defense ecosystem without needing U.S. approval. And for Ottawa, it was a leap from observer to co-architect of a new Indo-Pacific defense corridor. This wasn't just a symbolic handshake. It was a direct rewrite of the U.S.-dominated defense playbook. Next came development aid, an area where the U.S. has traditionally led with loud branding and big checks. But not this time. Just as Washington finalized a $60 billion slash to USAID, Ottawa stepped in with a $544 million development guarantee targeting climate-resilient projects in Latin America and the Caribbean. Wind farms in Jamaica, sustainable cocoa processing in Colombia, and disaster insurance for Honduras, Canada was no longer just attending global aid summits. It was leading them. But perhaps the most strategically important move, the launch of a critical minerals alliance, bringing together Canada's rare earths, cobalt and nickel reserves, with Germany's processing tech, South Korea's battery know-how, and Japan's recycling infrastructure. The message was clear: the new supply chain isn't running through Washington or Beijing. It's running through Ottawa, Berlin, Seoul, and Tokyo. Each of these moves, defense development and critical minerals, was a direct answer to a world asking, if the U.S. won't lead, who will? And in Alberta, at least, for a moment the answer wasn't Washington, it was Canada.
Canada and South Korea have pledged to deepen economic and security relations amid the ongoing supply chain crisis and North Korea's growing threat.
The decisions made in Alberta weren't just tactical, they were transformational. In his closing remarks, Prime Minister Mark Carney issued a line that cut deeper than most press soundbites. "We tried a new geometry of working together. Nostalgia is not a strategy." That wasn't a throwaway line. It was a public signal that Canada no longer sees itself as a junior partner to American power, but as a capable coordinator in its own right. And for the first time in G7 history, that wasn't just talk, it came with action. One of the most symbolic shifts occurred behind closed doors. During a critical bilateral session with South Korean President Lee Jung, U.S. diplomats were excluded from the room, and American journalists were kept at arm's length. Normally, Washington would be at the center of such defense discussions, but this time it wasn't even on the sidelines. Instead, Canada struck a defense industry swap. Sensor packages for Canadian Arctic drones would be manufactured in South Korea, and Seoul would gain the license to build hybrid-powered patrol ships based on Canadian designs. It was a strategic handshake that for decades only the Pentagon would have been expected to lead. Not anymore. This wasn't just a diplomatic win, it was a structural pivot away from U.S. dominance. Canada followed up with a move that caught even development analysts off guard. While Washington slashed $60 billion in USAID funding and canceled 90% of its multi-year development contracts, Ottawa stepped in with a $544 million loan guarantee initiative for Latin America and the Caribbean. It's not about matching the US dollar for dollar, it's about filling the trust vacuum. And Carney's plan to use guarantees rather than handouts signaled a shift toward long-term partnerships instead of transactional aid. In another era, these initiatives might have been framed as support acts. But in Alberta, Canada wasn't supporting, it was leading. Through climate lending, mineral alliances, and defense coordination, Ottawa laid down an architecture for a post-US cooperative framework, one where power is distributed, not concentrated in Washington. Carney wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The architecture he presented was clear. Less volatility, more trust. Less nostalgia, more action. For many countries watching, it wasn't a rejection of the United States, but it was a hedge against its unpredictability. And in today's global landscape, that hedge might be the foundation for the next order. It wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. President Trump's sudden departure from the G7 summit in Alberta just one day in left more than just empty seats. It left a power vacuum at the most strategic table in the Western world. Officially, the reason given was the escalating Israel-Iran crisis. But to many observers, the message was clear: the U.S. was walking off the field just as new players were lining up to take the lead. In past summits, that would have caused a stall. But in Alberta, the tempo picked up fast. Within hours of Trump's exit, Canada filled the agenda gaps. Meetings once expected to be coordinated by Washington were suddenly hosted by Ottawa, with leaders from Seoul, Berlin, and Tokyo stepping forward. South Korean media quickly dubbed the summit a pivot away from old alignments. Canadian outlets framed it more bluntly: if Washington won't lead, someone has to. For years, the G7 has been treated as a stage for U.S. grand strategy. But this time, it didn't feel like a U.S. show at all. It felt like a marketplace of alliances where mid-sized powers traded real agreements without waiting for American permission. And that shift didn't happen over months. It happened in less than 48 hours. The void left by Washington wasn't just noticed, it was seized. And once that precedent is set, the balance of influence doesn't just reset at the next summit, it changes for good. What happened in Alberta wasn't just a response to Trump's early exit. It marked the beginning of a structural shift in how global power is coordinated. For decades, G7 summits operated on a familiar gravitational pull. Washington set the tone, others followed. But this time, when the U.S. vacated its seat, Canada didn't just hold the line, it redrew it. Analysts from Brussels to Seoul are now calling this a multi-magnet moment, where the old unipolar model anchored around U.S. leadership gives way to a more distributed, flexible network of mid-sized powers. And Canada's G7 performance was a masterclass in what that new architecture could look like. With the U.S. sidelined, Ottawa quietly stitched together its own operating system for international coordination, fusing Arctic security with South Korea replacing U.S. development aid in Latin America, and launching a critical minerals alliance that links Canadian mining with German processing, Korean cell technology, and Japanese recycling expertise. These weren't symbolic declarations, they were signed frameworks backed by budgets, blueprints, and real-world supply chains. Prime Minister Mark Carney's mantra, "Nostalgia is not a strategy," was more than a slogan. It was a rejection of passive alignment with U.S. priorities and a pivot toward active, self-driven leadership. And that pivot wasn't subtle. American diplomats weren't even allowed in the room for Canada's bilateral with South Korea. Journalists noticed. So did global markets. What Canada demonstrated was textbook middle power diplomacy. Fill institutional voids, create practical incentives for cooperation, and anchor yourself in credible long-term projects. This isn't a replacement of U.S. power, but a rebalancing where countries like Canada no longer wait for Washington to act before moving. In effect, Ottawa has turned its geography and resource base, once seen as peripheral, into geostrategic leverage. And that leverage is already reshaping decisions across NATO, the Indo-Pacific, and the Western Hemisphere. Development guarantees in Honduras defense contracts with Seoul, rare earth shipments to Berlin, each move shows that Canada is no longer just reacting to global currents. It's starting to shape them. The question now is whether this is a one-off improvisation or the beginning of a lasting shift in the center of global coordination. Either way, the world just got a preview of a new kind of leadership. And for the first time in decades, that preview didn't come from Washington. What unfolded at the 2025 G7 summit wasn't just Canada stepping in for a missing ally. It was Canada stepping up with an entirely new playbook. While President Trump abruptly exited, leaving his seat empty, Prime Minister Mark Carney filled more than a protocol gap. In just 24 hours, Canada restructured the agenda, locking in a defense pact with South Korea, launching a Latin America aid guarantee, and activating a critical minerals alliance that bypassed U.S. supply chains entirely. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a functional alternative. From Arctic surveillance to climate finance, Ottawa didn't just react, it initiated. And in doing so, it proved that middle powers, when prepared and willing, can rewrite the rules of engagement even at a traditionally U.S.-anchored forum like the G7. The Alberta Summit wasn't a one-off. It was a rehearsal for a new world order, one where Washington is no longer the sole conductor of global coordination. Instead, a new geometry is emerging, multilateral, distributed, and led by states that used to follow. So now the question is simple but urgent. Is this Canada's breakout moment, a sign that a new global axis is forming from the north? Or is it the first domino in a more chaotic multipolar shift, where no one state, not even the US, can dictate the terms? Will Washington return to the table with renewed purpose, or will it be forced to play catch-up in a system it no longer controls? Your perspective matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more ground-up reporting on the world's new power players. And hit like if you believe the future of global leadership is shifting quietly but decisively northward.